12:03 Boston time. We'll get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of City and Transportation Planning at MIT. Today is really a great honor to have Professor Susan Handy join us to open the forum for this season here, right? This is the MIT Mobility Forum organized by the Mobility Initiative. As a start, I like to do a few warm-up exercise so that people are more participatory. Yeah. One key expectation for all the audience here is you contribute at least one idea in the chat, either a question to Professor Handy or comments, right? Either question or answer. I hope everybody can contribute some idea in this, right? So as a startup, I just, let's do a quick poll to understand a little bit about the audience here. The first one is a classic transportation question. What's your mode of travel? A primary mode of travel, whatever you self-identify with, right? So let's give 20 seconds. See the audience. Okay, 150 people participated. I'll give 10 more seconds. $174 people, 5. Okay, so I'll end the poll here and then share the result. Can you guys see the result? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so 20 people walking, 20 people cycling, 10 bus, 15 subway and rail, 16% shared ride, and then 21% car. Wow, very interesting. This create a different audience than the general public, but that's great to see this. Thank you. Yeah. So the second one, quickly, is to see your role broadly defined as either student, faculty, staff in the industry, government, NGO, others. Great. Yeah, so I'll share the result here. It's about a quarter student, quarter faculty, 20% industries, 18% government, NGO, others. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So lastly, I invite everybody to type in the chat your organization, your city, and your local time. So I would say Cambridge, MIT, Cambridge, 12, no. So we get a sense of the audience background here. Volpe Center, KTH, Hong Kong. So Chicago, yeah. Nice. Thank you, everybody. Susan, hopefully this also helpful for you to give you a context of who the audience is, right?
Oh my gosh.
Nice, yeah. So lastly, I would just say, today I'm really excited to have Professor Susan Handy join us for two specific reasons, right? One is Susan as a person, and two, shifting gear as a topic, right? Susan, I've been a student of Susan, reading his literature books for a long time. He's a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. He's a definite figure in the transportation policy and the planning arena. But the key thing I want to say is her work actually changed people's mind. I think there's a different set of notion about transportation, and Susan's work changes how people look at transportation. I think that's the most powerful thing I would make him. And also for today's topic, shifting gears, is specifically talking about this set of ideas, how these ideas is evolving or should they evolve, right? So without further ado, I pass this to Professor Susan Handy to open the forum for us. Susan, please.
Say, thank you. Let me make sure. Are you seeing the right screen?
Swap it.
Swap it.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share some of my thinking with you all. And there are a lot of you. Thank you all for being here. Now I'm a little nervous Because in fact, what
Susan, Susan, you haven't swapped yet.
Oh, I haven't swapped yet?
No.
Did it swap?
It then it still shows two phrases. Yeah,
It's swapping on my screen. Shoot. Let me stop. Try again. My apologies. Let's see. There we go. Now I see it. Okay. Does that work?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Let me jump back. Okay. Sorry about that. What I'm going to share with you today is a bit of what's in my first book, which will be titled Shifting Gears. And this is a fitting forum to share some of this with you because the book is going to be published by MIT Press at some point in the distant future. So I've been in the transportation profession now for over 30 years, I hate to admit. But over those years, I've done a lot of thinking about transportation and watching what's going on in the profession. And it's been an interesting ride all along the way, but I think we are at a very interesting moment. So on one hand, we are still pouring all kinds of money into our highway system and the expansion of our highway system. On the other hand, we are also pouring more money than ever into transit improvements, as well as other modes like walking and biking. So although I've been talking about the possibility of a paradigm shift in transportation planning for many years, in fact, I've used this particular slide many times, I think we are actually maybe really at the point where we are tipping towards a paradigm shift, shifting from an old way of approaching transportation planning where we focus on making it easier to drive to a new way where we focus on making it easier to not drive. But this paradigm shift is it's not just about what we do, what sort of investments we make, but it's also about why we do what we do. And I think it's ultimately about a change in how we think about transportation. So that's what I've been thinking about. And if you look closely at the transportation profession and peel back some of the layers, you find a set of core ideas that really have dominated what we as a profession have been doing for the last century. And this is my list of ideas that I think are important and have found particularly interesting. It's not necessarily an inclusive list of all of the important ideas. But clearly, it starts with this idea of freedom, that cars give us freedom, speed, faster is better, that we need mobility. And then the corollary of that is that congestion needs solving. We focus on vehicles and we think about streets as being the space that we give to cars. Capacity, we need more of it. We need a hierarchical system, and we design our roads to match the function of the roads. Separation, we need to separate modes where we can. We need to control things. And then finally, the big one at the end, that technology is going to solve our problems, right? So when you look at what's going on in the profession, you see evidence of all of these ideas. And in fact, they are deeply embedded in professional practice. I think about I think of them as the three big documents: the Highway Capacity Manual, the MUTCD, Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the AASHTO Green Book, and other traditional professional guidance like that. You see lots of evidence of these ideas. But there are some cracks in the pavement. And in fact, at the same time, there's a whole complementary set of ideas that are alternatives to this traditional way of thinking. And these ideas have in fact been around for a long time. You can find examples of transportation professionals talking about these things even a century ago. But they just never caught on the way the traditional ideas did. But what's changing now is that these ideas are moving more from the fringe and becoming more mainstream within the profession, to the point that we're even seeing some changes in those big three documents I talked about that reflect these newer ideas. So what I do in the book is go through these traditional ideas and their complementary alternative ideas, look at sort of how they've evolved within the profession, and think about the implications of these. And of course, I don't have time to talk about all of this with my remaining 15 minutes or so. So I decided to just focus on the idea of capacity, and of course, highway capacity in particular, and talk a little bit about what's going on there. And this is a topic in which I am very much myself currently immersed, as I'll talk about in a minute. So highway capacity, this really was one of the central missions of the transportation profession from the start. And, we first approached this by looking at where the congestion was, and then deciding that we needed to build highways and add capacity in those areas. We then moved to the predict and provide approach that we're still mostly using, where we use these travel demand forecasting models to look at where the congestion is going to be, some years in the future, and that's where we're going to provide our highway capacity. This approach, of course, did not sufficiently recognize the induced travel phenomenon, the problem that if you expand capacity, that in and of itself will generate additional driving, right? And what's interesting is that there were professionals who recognized this way back in the 1920s, who understood that that this expansion of the roadway system was itself contributing to the problem. And if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend this Brian Ladd article, where he looks at some of the historical discussion of this induced travel phenomenon. Well, by now we have lots of empirical evidence that shows that this in fact happens, that when you add highway capacity, you generate or induce additional driving. So this has been of great interest in California, where we're trying to reduce how much people drive as a part of our effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So some years ago, Marlon Bornett and I synthesized the research on this, reviewed and synthesized the research on this topic. I wrote this little policy brief that summarized what was going on. And, of course, it shows that if you increase highway capacity, eventually you get about the same amount of increase in vehicle miles of travel. And then interesting things happened. This is the fun part of the story. So, oh, I think there was another slide there, but anyway, I started to hear from advocates as well as reporters all around the country, and even sometimes outside of the country, who wanted to know more about this phenomenon. So clearly there was, sort of a growing interest in understanding what happens when we build capacity, and in understanding in particular this question of induced travel, a questioning of the need to be expanding our highway system. And I think this topic, I have talked to media people more about this topic than any other thing I've worked on over the years. Even though I'm not the one actually doing the research, I've simply been the one to help summarize and synthesize the research. So one thing we did to help out the effort in California was to take that empirical research and create a very simple induced travel calculator, which uses the elasticity that comes out of the empirical research and puts it together with data about current miles of highway in California and current vehicle miles of travel in California, and lets people estimate what would be the increase in VMT for a particular amount of highway expansion. And one thing we did with that calculator was then take a look at some of the estimates that were in the environmental impact statements for some of the highway projects in California, and found a very interesting thing that, in fact, some of those environmental impact statements didn't even talk about induced travel at all, and where they did have estimates, they were far lower than what our calculator estimated the induced travel would be. So this pointed to some limitations of our current predict and provide approach, in that our travel demand forecasting models really are not adequately accounting for the induced travel phenomenon. So the story goes on. Caltrans, our California Department of Transportation, after some expert review that was led by Betty Deacon, decided that our calculator was a legitimate tool for estimating induced travel. So that's now a part of the official guidance on how to do environmental review for highway projects. But there's still a lot of pushback. So the advocates who support highway building have been pushing back on this, and a lot of the agencies themselves. So our little calculator, which suggests a whole lot more induced travel than what than what the traditional travel demand forecasting models would suggest. That's kind of scary for these agencies, because under California's Environmental Quality Act, these agencies are now going to have to come up with mitigations for the increase in vehicle miles travel for building those highways. So, okay, the highway is going to generate VMT, additional VMT, and now they've got to come up with ways to offset that increase in VMT that the highways were creating. So you can see some of the flaws in the logic here. So this goes on. We're how this is playing out professionally. It's still going on. We'll see where it goes. But again, some cracks in the pavement. LA Metro has now dropped one of its proposed freeways that's been on the books for decades. So that's a big change, to say, hey, maybe we don't need this capacity expansion after all. And of course, the complementary idea to capacity expansion would be demand management, right? If congestion's a problem, and we know that adding capacity in the end does not really help us with congestion, then what do? Well, then maybe we need to manage demand. And of course, pricing being one of the primary ways to do that. So again, some cracks in the pavement. There seems to be a growing possibility of actually implementing pricing strategies in the US. So again, a shift in thinking that may be signaling a larger paradigm shift. So, boy, I think I'm going to wrap up a little early, but so I think in all of these cases, we're seeing some shift away from the traditional ideas towards these alternative ideas. But certainly it's partial at this point. In no case have we entirely shifted from the traditional idea to these more alternative ideas. So what we've got is sort of a mix of things, right? We may be adopting the new ideas, but we haven't yet let go of the old ideas. And I think the mobility and accessibility pair of ideas is a good example of this, where increasingly transportation professionals are talking about accessibility. And you see a lot of focus on accessibility in transportation plans, but we haven't let go of this idea of mobility and its corollary, the idea that congestion needs solving. So there's still a lot of focus on how are we going to reduce congestion. So that means we're kind of in a muddle with our transportation thinking, in my opinion, where we are thinking in some new ways, but we can't quite let go of the old ways. And I think we got to let go a little bit if we're actually going to make some progress and really fix our system and improve its sustainability and improve the quality of service that we're giving to our residents. And how I think of the current situation is a throw everything at it approach, where we're doing a lot of the new stuff, investing in transit, walking and biking. There's a lot of support for that, but we're still doing a heck of a lot of road building. So it's more of everything. And it's not clear that makes a whole lot of sense. One of my favorite examples, local examples, is in Marin and Sonoma County, where we spend $700 and some million building a commuter rail system between the two counties. At the same time that we're spending $700 and some million to widen the freeway that's perfectly parallel to the rail. If we were really serious about getting people onto transit and out of cars, we'd be putting the money into transit and not doing those roadway expansions. So we're kind of stuck, and I think what the field really needs is some deep thinking to get out of that muddle. So I hope with my talk today, I've gotten you thinking, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your ideas and questions and responses to all of this. And then when the book eventually comes out, which unfortunately is going to be another year, even though I've wrapped up my part of it, I'm hoping that that gets some people thinking a bit more deeply. And if I've accomplished that, then all is good. So
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. This for us, all of us are busy doing all the things in different parts of transportation, often forget in the end of the day, what is transportation for, right? So I think your talk really triggered this type of deep thinking on this. So here, I know that you only have 20 minutes to present, so you focus most on the capacity point, and you touch a little bit upon the mobility versus accessibility. Can you give us maybe a little bit more on, say, for example, separation, hierarchy, control, any of the other ideas, and give a flavor of them?
Yeah, so let me go, maybe it's helpful to stay on this slide. Yeah, well, each one of these is more than a talk in and of itself. I guess I see these sort of flowing in some kind of order. So for me, it really does start with this idea of freedom as maybe the most core idea. And along with that is speed, and that's related to efficiency, and then of course mobility. Hierarchy, separation, control are a little different, I would say, in that in these cases, it's not really about going from one to the other, but really about finding the right balance between them. And the profession has done some flip-flopping about sort of which version of this dominates. So, hierarchy and connectivity, that's the story of what happened with the design of our local street networks. and how we went from a grid system, which was all about connectivity and had, a little bit of hierarchy to it, but not so much, to the, the roadway hierarchy that most of you probably know, where you're thinking about freeways at one end of the hierarchy and cul-de-sacs at the other end of the hierarchy. And that was the dominant idea for many decades, starting even before World War II. But then, in the 90s or so, there was some pushback on that with movements like the new urbanism, that we needed to think more about connectivity. And, my own opinion is that, yeah, you need some hierarchy, but you definitely need connectivity. So it's really a matter of how do we design the network to get the kind of the right levels of both. Same thing for separation and integration. And then control versus chaos. That's kind of a fun one where, of course, we're controlling things all over the place, but the idea of naked streets,
yeah,
or roundabouts are kind of let's control it a little bit, and then we'll make the drivers sort of figure it out for themselves, right, as they circulate around the roundabout.
Yeah, on that, right.
So those are a little different, I would say.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe add a bit more on the control side. For example, nowadays there's a lot of trend in this autonomous vehicle, connected vehicle. One strand is to look at the whole city as a gigantic control system, right? The other side, and the pedestrian, particularly pedestrian cyclists, try to say, I want the degree of messiness, right? This chaos and my individual agency in this, right? Do you see how the technology trend through this better control, better AI, better prediction, versus the desire of the pedestrian to say, I want to entertain this type of chaos, right? How would you see this potential tension evolve into the future here?
Well, I don't know if I have the answer to that question, but technology, I'm a skeptic. And I think, kind of my message in that part of the work is, we've always had expectations about how technology was going to fix things and improve things. And rarely did technology work out the way we thought it was going to. Sometimes some technologies, we were talking about 100 years ago, and we still don't have them, like flying cars still aren't quite here. And then, so sometimes they just never quite happen. And then other times they happen, and then surprise, surprise, people use those technologies in different ways than what we anticipated. So, the Segway is an easy target here because it was held up as being, the savior of transportation. It was going to change everything. And it didn't, right? And now they're used mostly for tourists and sometimes for airports and mall security. So I think technology is certainly important, but we don't want to put all our eggs in that basket. And we need to think. I think sometimes we can't anticipate, fully anticipate how things are going to work out.
Right. So my second question is, to the left, this is kind of a classic set of ideas that we would have in the transportation. And you said there's some cracks, right? So many evolving to the right. Here, I guess, depending on which group are we speaking to, are we transportation planners, transportation engineers, or which part of transportation engineers, the politicians, the general public, the people living in the city versus in the rural? Can you give us a sense that to what degree these ideas evolved? Which one are leading the thinking? Which are still kind of resisting? Give a bit more detail on this.
Well, this was something I struggled with: is what is the transportation profession, right? Who counts as that? So, I have some definition in the book about it's the professionals who are involved in shaping what the transportation system is. So obviously people working for public agencies, but also the consulting firms and contractors and advocates and academics, and so it's a broad set of people. You can look at this list and say, okay, well, the left side, that's an engineering way of thinking, and the right side is a planning way of thinking, which I think is probably a valid generalization, but it is a generalization. And clearly it's not, there's no perfect correlation, right? So, the profession started out as an engineering profession. So it makes sense that the traditional ideas, are affiliated with engineering. But plenty of engineers think like the right-hand side, and there are plenty of planners who are involved in, who think along the lines of the left side. So I really don't want to make it about an engineering versus planning discussion, but let's take a look at these ideas and think about them critically, all of us,
right,
whatever perspective we're coming from.
right,
Yeah, and then of course, they're the decision makers, and that's a whole nother thing.
yeah,
And the public too, right? I mean, if the profession can't fully shift unless the public and the policymakers are shifting too, right? We've all got to shift.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So one more question specific on the capacity and the induced demand here, right? I want to see your opinion on in the developing world where many of the basic mobility system is not ready yet, right? They want to build a road, they want to build railways, etc., right? So when is the time we should say, oh, let's really worry about the induced demand, don't build more, versus there's just a basic layer of mobility infrastructure need to improve on this, right? So what's the distinction in the more industrialized, well-developed country versus developing country discussion in this aspect?
Again, I don't know if I can answer that, but I guess, yeah, and even within the U.S., there are going to be situations where capacity expansion makes sense for one reason or another. It's more a matter of the focus, and I guess for other parts of the world. My message would be, think about it carefully, right? I mean, they don't necessarily have to follow the U.S. model of highway dependence. There are other kinds of capacity that might provide the kind of mobility and accessibility that they need. The freight thing, I really just, that's a whole nother discussion that I'm not so qualified to talk about. But that obviously comes into play here too. And probably for freight, you could do a similar sort of, thinking about what are the ideas that have dominated our thinking about freight and how might that be.
Right. Yeah. So thank you. So maybe the last question from my side, I don't give it to John. Susan, you triggered a whole set of questions in the chat side. I mean, we probably cannot finish all of them, but we'll compile them, share with you afterwards. This is so interesting discussion in the chat.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it.
Around there, yeah. Maybe the last question from me is look at the federal government role in this, right? Because a lot of the discussion has been the local side, for the state side, a lot of interaction between, there's some tension between the cities and the state government, etc.
Yes.
But from the federal side, there's some excitement, right? We have the infrastructure bill, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, etc. So there's some good push in this. How much do you see as this opportunity from the federal government towards this trend that you are talking about?
I think the federal role is very important. There's a lot that they can influence, but the way the system is set up, there's still a lot of power at the state level with the state DOTs in terms of how the money gets spent. And that's, you see some really big differences. Well, the differences aren't as great as we might think between a place like Texas and California. The rhetoric's very different, but we're still building a lot of highways in California, even though we talk about a lot of other things. So yeah, I think federal policy really big influence. I mean, certainly, starting back in 1991 with ICE-T, when federal funding first became available for things like bicycle and pedestrian projects, that's made a huge difference. And then, the recent bill that put more money into transit than we'd seen before. But letting go of the highway building idea and the focus on reducing congestion, that we're still hanging on to that at the federal level as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Susan. So now I'll give it to John for the questions from the audience. John, please.
Susan, we have an explosion of questions in the chat. It's overwhelming. This is where I'm really missing Annie Hudson. Many of you recall Annie would do this curation part of the mobility forum, and she did such a wonderful job. She's joined AB Volvo now, so she's off in Gothenburg, Sweden. I hope she's watching, but I'm missing her moderation talents at this point. But let me try to make sense out of what we've seen in the chat. There's a whole set of questions around the core relationship that you laid out, which is to say, increasing capacity, and by that we mean building lanes effectively, has two impacts. The first impact is to increase vehicle miles traveled. The second impact is on congestion, or the flip side of congestion being travel time. And I wonder if you could just sort of return to that equation and to sort of lay out from a values perspective, because there's a lot of questions. Well, what's really important? Because increasing vehicle miles traveled actually increases access. So maybe that's a good thing. But from a customer or user perspective, we want to get to where we're going in general. Most drivers want to get there faster. And you're saying we're not seeing much of an impact there. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that equation.
Right. So when you widen the highway, a congested highway, right? The widening will reduce travel times, at least initially.
Yes.
That is, in effect, a decrease in price. So as economic theory tells us, you decrease the price, people are likely to consume more. And when you talk about a highway, it means people will make trips that they otherwise wouldn't have because of the congestion. Now that it's a little faster, they may make additional trips. They may choose farther destinations than they did before. They may switch modes. So instead of taking bus, they go back to driving. People may make different decisions about where they live relative to work. Businesses may make different decisions about where they choose to locate. And then, ultimately developers may make different decisions about what they develop where. So there are a lot of things that change when you widen the freeway. You are not just serving the existing driving that is on that freeway. It's going to change everything. So what the research shows is that within some period of time, 5 to 10 years, a 1% increase in the highway capacity will produce a 1% increase in VMT. So you get back to where you were to begin with in terms of congestion levels. And I think we've all seen this, right? I mean, we've been doing this for decades. We keep widening the freeways and it's good for a little while and then we're congested again. So you're not solving congestion. You are carrying more VMT. Now, is that a good thing?
That's the question.
Yeah, maybe not. If it really is enabling people to do more things, then you could say, yeah, I guess that's a good thing. But of course, it comes with a lot of negative environmental impacts that you've also got to consider. Right. And then, there was just a great editorial on one of the Reed's blog or one of those others. I'm sorry, I can't remember who the author was, but talking about, well, you may not actually be able to get to more things because of all these secondary effects that tend to disperse activities. You know, it could be that because of the freeway, you're not any closer to anything that you need to get to. So that's, you know, that's where the, you know, the focus on accessibility rather than mobility becomes important. That if you can ensure that people can get to what they need to get to without having to go so far, then congestion doesn't matter so much, right? And you don't need that kind of highway capacity to ensure that people can do what they need to do. Hopefully somebody put a note about that editorial in there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Andres Sevstek, who's on the faculty at MIT, he put a question in the chat. I actually wonder if we could just get Andres to ask his, there he is. Andres, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Handy, for your talk. I wanted to ask, specific to the context of California, where so much of the built environment has radically been built around the car in the 20th century, how these kind of stick policies of, or at least reducing capacity growth or putting a price on a highway lane are perceived when so many people have no viable alternative, right? That's what we're really up against, is that vast populations have no other way of getting around than by car, and it'll take far longer to adjust the built environment than it will to implement short-term policies to limit car driving or VMT. So to what extent do you think these conversations about urban planning and land use development are understood hand in hand with the highway conversations? And I just anecdotally, when I visit friends in LA, and most of whom have happily voted for Measure R or Measure M, still never take a bus, still never take a train. Yeah. It's sort of perceived that somebody else will, and it'll just like relieve my congestion. But it's not necessarily what's happening.
Right, that's true. And I think, you know, what you're talking about is why we're not, we may be thinking about the need for transit and, you know, rebuilding our streets and improving improving transit, focusing on accessibility, rebuilding our streets so that they're more people friendly. You know, we're doing all of that stuff along with increasing densities in California. And there's been a lot of change to the built environment. But as I said, we're still sort of hanging on to this highway capacity idea. And I think it's for the reasons that you say, is that because we still are, despite our progress, very dependent on cars. So anytime you talk about not taking care of the needs of cars, you run into those arguments that we have to have this capacity because people don't have a choice. So it's a challenge. It's a kind of a chicken and an egg thing. You've got to make the alternatives viable before you can go very far to making driving worse, whether by pricing or other means. But that said, if we keep expanding the highways, then that reduces the incentive to do anything else. So it's self-defeating, right? So we've got to find a way to speed up what we're doing to provide alternatives, and I think start to do some of the getting away from that idea that we need to be making driving easier. I think what we need to be making driving less necessary, and that's got to be the overarching idea from a sustainability standpoint, as well as equity and ultimately economic reasons as well.
I think that's a powerful statement. The goal should be to make driving less necessary. I think that helps a lot to put it into context. Along the lines of this values discussion, Jeffrey Shriver from the Chicago DOT also had a question that's a values related question. I wondered, Jeffrey, if you could just ask your question directly.
Sure. Yeah, I had a comment on this, and thanks again, Professor Handy, for sharing your time with us and your thoughts. That it just seems like maybe I'm paraphrasing my own comments here, but that, automobiles are inherently like an exclusionary transportation mode, right? Not everybody can, should, or will want to drive, especially not drive alone and drive at high speeds. And so by promoting transportation infrastructure that's just about cars and about cars going fast, we're implicitly basically relegating anybody who doesn't drive for whatever reason to a sort of second class citizenship. And that's just like, it is a values judgment, but it's inherently just wrong. Like why and what, like in what sense is it a valuable thing to exclude anybody who can't, shouldn't, or doesn't want to drive from full participation in life? And so it just underscores what you've been saying.
Yeah, my values are your values. Yeah, I explore some of that in that first chapter about freedom, because there's so much focus on, we have to have our cars. It lets us do anything we want, but that's not absolutely true. Even those of us with cars are kind of slaves to our cars. We spend a heck of a lot of money on them. And then there's so much of the population that doesn't drive and is harmed by driving. So that's really important. I played with different words here. I'm using the word ideas, but beliefs, in some ways these are beliefs, and they are clearly, all of these ideas are tied to values. I was just a little afraid of getting into a values discussion, but it is implicit here. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Excellent. So Takahiro Yabe had an interesting question. So moving away from cars to transit and walkable streets is great. We see this in places like Boston, but such policies are often limited to upscale, wealthy areas. Maybe this could result in more cars traveling through poorer areas, causing environmental injustice. How can we address this inequality through policy and technology? Thoughts? Obviously, justice factored into your first slide. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think if we adopt the ideas on the right, that leads us towards a more equitable system where we've got better service across the population with less impact. So I think this all sort of fits into that idea that we to achieve a more equitable system. To do that, we're going to have to make drivers a little worse off. I think that's kind of a given, but maybe not very much worse off. And drivers have been winning for a century, right? They've been really winning the game. So that's kind of a point I end on is, it's okay. Make them give up a little bit to make sure that we've got a more sustainable, equitable system for everybody in the end. Everybody will be better off. So I'm not sure if that directly addressed that, but I didn't have the answer to that question.
No, that's great. We had a very practical question about the funds that were to be spent on the highway expansion in LA. Do we have a sense of where those funds are now being diverted to?
Ooh, I don't know. Maybe somebody from LA can chat that, whether it was, they actually had the funds programmed and then shifted it. It may not have been kind of that far along in the process. But LA, that's a good example of this kind of muddleness. There's oodles of money going into improving the transit system there, but still there's more money going into the highway system.
Yeah. And then Susan, one last question. So Lisa Altman Hall said, can you speak a little bit about your thoughts on the relationship to housing policy? And we chatted a little bit about this before the session. Land use and housing. Tell us a little bit more about your thinking there.
Yeah, you can't talk about transportation without talking about land use. So this, the book focused on the transportation profession, but to do, to make this shift to new ideas also means doing a better job of integrating what we're doing with transportation with what we're doing on the land use side of things. And that includes obviously housing, and especially affordable housing, and making sure we've got affordable housing where it needs to be relative to where the jobs are and where our substantial investments in transit are. And that's the kind of change we are seeing, in the Bay Area. You see that. I mean, places like Boston and New York have always had some nice complementarity between land use and transportation. But yes, we need more of that.
Excellent.
Okay. One thing California just did, we were talking about this earlier, that I think is really cool, is made it really easy to take old shopping centers and turn them into housing, which huge potential in terms of converting that land. I'm very excited about that one.
Fabulous example. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Jinhua to wrap us up.
Thank you, John. So I'll say, Susan, this is really the best possible opening for this whole forum, really lay out the purpose, the fundamental value of transportation system there, right? So everybody, please join me. Thank Professor Susan Handy for the presentation and the conversation. Great.
Well, thank you all. I can't wait to see your comments and your questions. And thank you for being here.
In the last 2 minutes, I'd like to share with everybody the whole design of this season's forum sessions. So Susan opened with the shifted gear, and Jimmy Aloisi and Fred Sauci, who are two major thinker and a politician and a researcher in this area, talk about the public transit in the United States, look at the challenges because of COVID, because of finance, the safety issues, and the opportunity today. After that, we have Professor Stephen Barrett and Bill Green talk about the three very hard to decarbonize area of transportation, airline industry, long-haul trucking, and oceanary shipping. Next, Professor Chris Zigouras and Siqi Jian will talk about the road transit and the denseness of São Paulo as example. Then we have a follow-up panel on the worker future and mobility. Professor Kalkman will talk about the credit-based congestion pricing for win-win traffic solution. Right. We'll also try to have some remarks about the New York City's congestion charging debate at the moment. After that, Professor Daniela Rus and her team will describe another major simulator in the autonomous vehicle realm that can be used for the data-driven simulator for the multimodal sensing and policy learning for AV. After that, Professor Mamasani will talk about telemobility, hybrid work, and the next normal. Followed by Professor John Paul McDuffie from Wharton School, talk about a new pathway towards solving the emergent problem of the electric vehicle sector. Professor Alex Jacquelet will talk about in this on-demand ride-sharing and micro-mobility system, what's the flexibility and coordination issue. Professor Jing Li will talk about the pricing and location choice for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Professor Dan Spurling will talk about electric vehicle policy and pitfalls in general. And then Dan Fruit will finish with the supply of AV in open platform. Hope that's a useful description of the whole session. And I'd like to see many of you more next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.